A yay! I've never had a yay before. Arms cheering at the back. Anyone else want to advance on yays and arms in the air? Alright, I should probably stop now, shouldn't I? Hello. I'm here from Swansea. We're going to talk about contract cheating. I'm going to fight the urge to walk up and down the stage as I normally do, because I understand that the sound will be lost from the video if I do that, so I'll try and stand still. I'm going to start with something I think is very important in any presentation, but especially important at an academic integrity conference. I want just to say thank you to all of the people who've been involved in the work that I'm going to talk about. Some of them are here today, Tracy and Kath from the OLT funded project, Michael Draper, who we'll hear from later as part of the workshop on legal approaches to contract cheating, and various other people from around the world who've been doing this work. It's a global problem. We've got global researchers working on it. I also want to thank you for being here and participating in this, and to thank the organisers for inviting me to be here to talk about this. I was here 2 years ago talking about this, and I thought I'd better have a look at what I said 2 years ago, just to make sure I don't say the same thing. And it was really interesting to see how much has happened in those 2 years, how much we have actually done to try and develop strategies to address this issue. Some of those I'm going to talk about, a lot of them Tracy's talked about, and you'll hear about from other people throughout the conference. So, what are we talking about? Very simply then, we're talking about the relationship between a student and an assessment. Right? And this has been around since education has been around. Students are assessed so they can demonstrate their learning, we can gatekeep that they are competent and so on. And there are always, have been, there probably always will be, students who for whatever reason can't or don't want to do the work themselves. So they hire somebody else to do it. And that has been around for a very long time. There have also been companies around for a long time that can make that happen. But this is one of the things that has taken off, if you like, in the last 30 years or so. With the advent of the internet, this transaction has become much easier. There are companies who exist to make this happen. In the early stages, what these companies did is they would put up databases of pre-written essays. So students who had written an essay on a particular topic would upload that to one of these databases, and then other students who were wanting to write an essay on a similar topic would search the database, and they could find work that other students had done, and they could draw inspiration from that. This has largely moved on, actually, in the last few years to be superseded by more sophisticated file sharing sites and bigger, more complex systems where students can upload multiple different types of documents, including other essays and other resources. And then the key thing is that there is still some sort of transaction. The students normally have to pay to get access to this, or they have to upload their own essays, and in response to that, they get access to essays written by, or assignments written by other people. What happened, though, as the industry evolved was that it became possible to order a bespoke, custom-written assignment from one of these companies. And I'll show you the very basics of what this looks like in a second. But what we think happens in a lot of cases is that a student will go to one of these websites, they'll order an assignment, and then what happens behind the scenes, there's some sort of internal private auction whereby the work is auctioned off to writers who bid for the opportunity to do it, and the writer who bids the lowest price and gets the work done on time is the one who's awarded the job, and the market forces keep the prices down and the profits up. So this is an anonymized, very generic representation of what happens when a student goes to one of these sites. So they go to a particular landing page with lots of glossy advertising on it, and they'll go to place an order, and this is the sort of information that they will provide in order to get their assignment done. So they'll provide the subject, what type of work they want, and this is an important point that will come up repeatedly. We talk mostly about essays, but multiple different types of work are possible, PhD, theses, master's dissertations, and so on. How long do you want it to be? What academic level do you want? Do you want it to pass? Do you want a distinction? Do you want a merit? And so on. Is it a degree level, or is it a further education qualification, or a master's, postgraduate? What referencing style do you want? How many sources do you want used? What language do you want it on? Do you want a summary added? How soon do you want it? And I have to say, I did this last night, and this was the default information that's present on the site. All right, so this is just a standard generic custom essay writing site, and the default position that you start from is, do you want it in 3 days? All right, which has moved on even from the research we did a few years ago. Do you want it high priority so you can have it quicker? The topic, that's where you put in the actual title of the assignment. Instructions, and these are where the detailed information goes. Preferred writer ID, right, which means if you've purchased this from a particular writer before and you've liked their work, you can use them again and again and again and request them. Challenges then for all of the linguistic approaches that we've talked about in some of the other sessions. Whoops, hold on a second. And files, then you can attach the file, so you upload the assignment brief that's been downloaded from Blackboard, enter your details, and away you go. Now, one of the things we tried to do, what we thought was a really simple piece of research. We just wanted to know how many of these companies there are, and I've given you the punchline already, so I'll go straight to it. We started doing this last year, and I thought this was important because there's a lot of excitement in the media and in higher education circles about this issue, and a lot of perception that it is a big issue and there's a really big problem with this. And I thought, well, one thing we need to know is just how many sites are there? If there's only a handful, it's probably not as big a deal as some people are making out. So I started looking, and I got to about 150, and I thought I need to hire a project student to help me with this. So I packed him off to Starbucks with a laptop and said, look, just sit for the afternoon and see how many you can come up with. And 3 weeks later, after a lot of espresso, he was still going. And we got up to about 880, 890. And then I shared our list with Kath Ellis, who has a similar list. And she said, well, there's very little overlap. And we're up to about 1,000. Now, that's not to say there are 1,000 companies. Many companies own a lot of sites with subtle differences aimed at different markets. But the point is, if a student searches for an opportunity to buy an essay, they are presented with many, 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 many opportunities to do that. Okay. There are other ways to get this work done, though. That sort of custom essay writing service is what we generally think of as the standard portrayal of this issue in the media. But there are many other ways to pay somebody else to get work done. And one of the things that's moved on is the general idea, the general concept in economics about how these types of work can get done. Basically what we're talking about is students using what we now call the gig economy to contract work out. Right? There are online auction sites where people post a job, people post bid for the opportunity to do the job, and those jobs can come in many, many different forms, but one of the types of work that is posted is academic writing. Right, now, I'll show you an example. I should mention also that some of the companies will use these auction sites to get work done very, very cheaply. And this is an example from one of the scandals that Tracy was talking about yesterday. This is from the site Airtasker, and an expose on that in Western Australia today. This is a screenshot that they took of some of the work that was posted on there. And I want to be really clear here, especially to the cameras, that these are not cheating sites we're talking about now. Right? There are many, many different auction, gig economy type sites where people post legitimate work. And you can see on there, or possibly you can't, somebody wants their bedroom steam cleaned. Right? And somebody is bidding for the opportunity to do that. And you can get anything done through these sites. Code writing, or website building, analysis doing, assessments writing. And that is where a lot of this work gets done, and a lot of the work that's done there is cheaper really than the work that gets done through the more traditional, if you will call them that, custom essay writing sites. Now, most of what we're talking about is essays, and that's what the literature has been on about this for many, many years, but it's very important that we make the point that although I will continue to talk about essays, really anything is possible. All right, and this is a point that Tracy was making yesterday, and I really want to reiterate. Particularly through these gig economy type sites, you can get anything done. You can get a PhD thesis written, you can get a presentation written with notes for you to speak from, you can get some analysis done, you can get a practical write-up, and so on. Now that's not to say that all of these are as easy or as cheap as each other. And certainly a 3,000 word essay on a generic topic in a week is far easier to get than an oral presentation, for example. But the key point is that, and I think this is a point that Kellen was making, we're never going to stop this by any of the methods that we're going to talk about, but we can make it harder. Right? We can make it easier for people to do the right thing. Okay, so before we get on to what will work, let's talk briefly about what won't work. And one of the things that we've actually tested, which Tracy briefly mentioned yesterday, in the early literature about this, there was a lot of talk about the simple solution to this. You just give students less time to do the work. Don't give them 3 months to write an essay, give them 3 weeks, for example. Then there's less time for this transaction to happen. Now, in these auction sites that we talked about, we can take advantage of the fact that there's a lot of data available in there about what's going on and how quick and cheap this is. And we sat down and just worked through a lot of the postings on 2 of these sites to work out how quickly is the work turned around. And the average was 5 days. And that was 3 or 4 years ago, and you've just seen from the post this morning that it's probably quicker now. Part of that is because I think the most interesting thing that we found from that study was that for every job that was delivered on time and on budget, there were 10 other writers bidding to do the work on time and on budget. So it was then a buyer's market, and that probably explains a little bit about why I think it's now even quicker and cheaper than it was just 3 or 4 years ago. Tracy also talked yesterday about some of the stuff we've done in Australia, where we've asked students, okay, here are lots of parameters of assessment. Which of these would make it more likely that you might contract out the work? And actually, the top result from those was a short turnaround time. So not only will it not help, it might actually make things worse. Okay. The summary then of what this looks like is it's big in terms of the availability of the services. We'll talk about how many students are using it in a second. It's cheap, or at least cheap options are available. It's very quick, it's very versatile. You can get many different types of things. And it's very well established. Tracy talked yesterday about some of the advertising these sites use, and many of the media stories that are about this talk about the fact that they're advertising all over the place, in legitimate places, because, again, this is a very important point. The companies that we're talking about, in most cases, are legitimate legal businesses. All right? I mean, under current law in most countries, they're doing nothing wrong, we think, although more to come later. Yes, nothing illegal. Debate the difference between wrong and illegal at another day. All right, so what I want to do before I get into the assessment and the law and the education is just take a few minutes to talk about some very preliminary work that we've been doing very recently on this central question. How many students are doing this? Right? Because whenever you talk to people about this, they want to know 2 things really, first of all. How big is it? How many students are doing it? And is it legal? Right? And the easy answer to this question is we don't really know. Right? There's no good objective measure of this. That's part of the appeal of it for some people. And it's very difficult to detect. So how do you objectively determine how big the issue is? One of the things you can do is you can just ask students, have you ever done this? Right? Now, any psychologist, criminologist, person with common sense will tell you, asking people, have you ever done anything you're not supposed to do, is a research method with certain flaws in it. Particularly if it's an academic or a university asking students, have they done something they weren't supposed to do in university. So the data that we get from these sorts of studies have some limitations. But what we can do is take advantage of the fact that actually this question, and variants of it, has been asked a lot over the years. All right. Questions around, have you paid for this, have you ever purchased this, has been asked many, many times. So what we've done, and again I thought this would be fairly straightforward and it turns out to have been much bigger than I realized, was just to try and identify all those studies that have asked that question and take advantage of the basic principles of meta-analysis to put them all together to come up with a sort of baseline figure for how big this issue is. So what I'm about to show you is very much under construction. Now, this is preliminary analysis, but I think there's a couple of the things that are very interesting, so I want to share them with you. But I would be grateful if for these next 2 or 3 slides we could keep them to ourselves. I'm happy them to go on the video because I can explain the context. But I showed some preliminary analysis of this at a conference 2 weeks ago, and those slides ended up on Twitter, and the analysis has changed since then, so the figures are wrong, and I think it's easier if we just keep this for the conference for now. Although I don't think actually the headline interpretation is going to change. So, what have we done? We have identified 44 studies going back to about 1995, including 37,782 participants. And this doesn't yet include any data from the study that Tracy was talking about yesterday, because the questions we asked there were in a slightly different format. Going back around the world. And all we've done for the first piece of preliminary analysis is to take 37,782 and take the number of participants in all those studies who've said, yes, I have done this, and calculate a basic percentage around the world, how many students say they're doing this. The figure is 3.1%. All right, now, I've probably said it 5 times, let me say it 6. Caveat, there's a lot of variance in here, there's a lot of factors that are going to influence how likely students are to say that they've done this. But overall, I think the punchline is not going to change, that it is a small percentage of the total number of students around the world that say they're doing this. Right, now, whether that's an important percentage is something we can come back to in a second. But overall, the average number is quite low as a percentage of total students. Another thing we can do with these data, though, is plot them against time. Right? Because another thing that we're repeatedly told is that this is a growing, evolving, fast-developing threat to quality in higher education and so on. And we can plot the percentage of students that say they've done this over time with all the different studies that we've got, and just get a basic gut reaction as to whether or not there's a problem that's increasing, I should say. Let me show you what the data look like. Now, any good research methods class I've ever been on says the first thing you do with quantitative data is you visualize it and you eyeball it, and you just say, what's going on? Do you think anything's going on? No, nobody's wanting to, there's some commitment from the front.
We don't know enough.
We don't know enough. There's a lot more to know, and there's a lot of factors that are going to influence whether or not students are going to say yes or no. But I think it's... which is why it's preliminary, and we're going to work further on this. But I think there's something going on if we retroactively fit a line onto our data of 2012 and say, is there a difference there? Is there something going on over time? And we can do this in various different ways. Over time, the older studies going back to 1994, the average percentage of students who said that they would have done this is less than 2%. Since 2012, it's gone up. It's 7.5%. Now, there is a lot going on, as has been pointed out, and one of the things we need to be clear about is that a lot of these older studies are in North America, and a lot of the older studies have bigger sample sizes than some of the newer studies. The newer studies tend to be smaller, there are some big ones in there, and they're from a much more diverse population, but I think it's reasonable to infer from this, with the caveats I already explained, that something looks like it's happening. And we need to, at the very least, keep an eye on this to see if this carries on. Okay, end of the under construction, but still some data that are unpublished. Another way we can get to this is we can say to staff, how many of your students do you think are doing this? And this is some work we've been doing with Rebecca Audrey from the University of Canberra. We've surveyed staff in the UK and in Australia and just asked them that basic question, and the figure that they give us is 10%. And again, this is not uncommon. You ask staff how many of your students are doing this, and they tend to give you a higher estimate for multiple different behaviours than students when you ask them, are you doing this? So I think it's reasonable for us to say, the punchline's probably not going to change. It's a small percentage of the total numbers of students. Is it a significant number of students? Is it something we need to be aware of? Different people have different interpretations of that, but I think it's, pick it somewhere in the middle, let's call it 6.5% of students in higher education are doing this. I think that's a problem. It's certainly something we can't ignore. Okay, so let's get on to the things that are in the abstract then. Assessment, design, legal approaches in education, and again I want to make this point. The stuff we're going to talk about is going to make this less likely, it's going to make contract cheating hopefully less likely, and it's going to make it easier for students to do the right thing, hopefully. We're not going to solve this, we're not going to change human psychology with designing good assessments, but we can make it easier for students to do the right thing and make it harder for contract cheating to happen. So, what do? Well, we take advantage of the fact that a British person is coming to Czechia, 2 countries with a fine tradition of drinking beer, and we can put some ale into the situation. If ale is a very British term, I apologise, it's a British term. for beer. It doesn't actually stand for beer. We aren't really going to pour beer on anyone. We're going to talk about some work we've done on assessment design, some of the legal work that we've been doing. But the thing that I want to focus on for the most time and start with right now is on education-based approaches and why education is important in dealing with this issue. Let me talk about two studies that we've done that speak to this and that bring up multiple issues that are relevant, I think. The first was a study that I did a little while ago, and I did talk about back in 2015, and I'll just briefly summarize the headlines here. We did a study that's very common in academic integrity research. You take your particular sample of students, in my case it was students that were new to higher education, and you show them a variety of scenarios and you say, what do you think about this? Is this wrong? And if it's wrong, what should happen to the student who's engaging in the behavior described in the scenario? And the punchline really was that for all of the behaviors that were clearly misconduct, the students recognized that, more or less. They knew that it was wrong, but they consistently recommended penalties or outcomes that were more lenient than would be imposed by their institution. And this was the most glaring, this mismatch was the most glaring for contract cheating. We showed them a barn door example of contract cheating with no mitigation whatsoever, and the students recommended very, very lenient outcomes. And that's important from an education perspective because it speaks to the fact that we need to make sure students understand what's going on here and what their institution might do and what the outcome might be if they use these services. Okay. The second study that I want to talk about is the most recent one we've done actually. And this time we were focusing on academics themselves, the educators, the people who are teaching the students. And the question we were asking was, are we educating educators about academic integrity? Now, we didn't focus on contract cheating here, but I'll pull out some of the data that are relevant to it. But I think that the headline messages are more about academic integrity generally, but they're definitely relevant. What we did was we took advantage of the fact that many of us are given or recommended or forced to buy textbooks about how to teach in higher education. In the UK, most universities run postgraduate courses for their staff and faculty development courses for their staff, but they teach them how to teach, how to design a PowerPoint, how to write a multiple choice question, how to facilitate a small group, how to support and mentor and supervise students, all of the things that we do as academics. There are courses to help us do that, and there are textbooks that support those courses. And we identified the most commonly recommended textbooks, added to the list with some that we were also familiar with, and just analyzed those and said, what are they telling us about academic integrity? These were the 6 most popular, and they're going to be, I'm sure, familiar to many of you. Biggs and Tang on the top right there, Fry, Kettridge and Marshall, by far and away the 2 most commonly recommended, and Paul Ramsden, another really big name in higher education, and then some assessment books down there on the right. And in total, like I said, we identified 20 books, and we analyzed them in 3 different ways. The first thing we did was just a really simple analysis of the signposts that exist in any sort of textbook, that are a textbook's way of saying, these are the important things in this book that you need to be aware of, that if you're looking for, here's where you find them. So the index, the table of contents, the title, the chapter titles, and so on. And we identified a long list of words that were relevant to academic integrity, and we just looked for those words in those parts of the textbooks, just to see where they were, if they were there, and so on. Unsurprisingly, the most common word that we found, but again, only in 12 of the 20 textbooks, was plagiarism. The word cheating we found in 6 of the books, and there were lots of other words which we won't go into the detail, that were found in about 6 to 10 of the books. Obviously, the top of our list was the phrase academic integrity. That's why we're here. It's a philosophy to addressing these issues that has been around for a very long time, and one that many of us are very passionate about and have advocated for a long time. And we look for this phrase in the index, in the chapter titles, and the titles and so on. Guess how many books had it in?
3.
Not a single one. Not a single one. And the more I've reflected on this, the more startled I am by it, really. I mean, if you think about all the work that has been done to take us towards a more positive and proactive, institutional, holistic approach to dealing with these issues, and yet it's not permeated through into this part of the mainstream discourse about higher education. We did obviously look for contract cheating, didn't feature at all. Essay mill did feature in one of the books, and again, it's a very small and almost anecdotal data point, but essay mill features, but contract cheating does, academic integrity doesn't. Okay, this is a quote from one of the books, and again, I don't want to overuse, I want you to overinterpret the quote, because it doesn't represent all of the books, or even the content of just one of the books, but it does contain a lot in there. This is from Paul Ramsden. It's a very influential and important and a figure in higher education who's done a lot of very good work for HE. And this is what he said about the issue. Well, one of the things he said: no unbiased study of the written machinery of assessment procedures could fail to conclude that we think students are at heart plagiarists and cheats. Now, there's a double negative in there, which makes things a bit complicated. But really, I mean, it's so interesting to see that and try and think about what that means. And my interpretation of it is that a lot of people are very uncomfortable about talking about these issues. They want to promote all the positive and good aspects of HE, but you can throw the baby out with the bathwater. Okay, we can't ignore this stuff. We can't ignore that it goes on. We have to have steps in place to deal with it and promote academic integrity, and this, I think, is just going too far. Okay, so the two other ways that we assessed these books, we did two very basic thematic analyses. All right, and anyone who's familiar with thematic analysis will know there are two basic ways that you can do it. You can do a bottom-up analysis. So basically, we just identified all the passages of all the books that had sections relevant to these issues, and we just read them all and said, what are they telling us? What are the common themes that emerge from that? And we took the second type of thematic analysis, the top-down approach, where we took Jude Carroll's handbook, we updated it with information from the Handbook on Academic Integrity, and we said, look, what do we want these books to say? What are the things that we would like to see in these textbooks? What are the messages that we would like academics to be getting about these issues? And we did both these analyses. And it's very hard to simply summarize qualitative data on a PowerPoint slide as part of a presentation, but I will try. And I'm helped by the fact that there wasn't a lot in there, right? And what was in there, a lot of it reflected the keyword analysis. There was a lot of focus on plagiarism and cheating, right? There was some good stuff in there. Don't let me appear too critical. There was lots of tips about assessment design. Some of them perhaps naive in terms of the things that we've all talked about the ways that these systems could be gained. But there was a lot of focus on assessment design as a way of promoting academic integrity, or the used phrase, and making cheating and plagiarism less likely. And there was a sub-theme that specifically emerged about not going back to exams. Just because you think that this may be an issue, don't go back to exams. I think most of us agree that that's a good thing. Another really important set of themes that emerged had as an overarching theme the need to consider students as part of this. Right? And there were three sub-themes within there. The need to engage with students as part of good higher education generally. Engage with them, make sure that they're having a good learning experience, that they have access to all the things that they need, they know how to do the right thing, and good things will follow. Educating students, again, making sure that they know how to write, how to reference, where to go to get help. Also need to know what happens if something goes wrong, that there are policies and procedures in place, and to be aware of them and to be clear and transparent about what that is. And then the final thing was a need to understand the pressures that are on students. Understand what the literature says, and there's a lot of literature about this, about why students get into trouble with academic integrity, why they commit misconduct, the pressures that are upon them that may make these things happen. And this, I think, we can expand upon this a little bit more generally and say we need to apply this principle specifically to contract cheating and ghostwriting and essay mills. We need to understand why this is happening. There aren't 1,000 websites for no reason. All right? It's a market, and there clearly is a market for this, and we need to understand where that's coming from so that we can make it that less likely and make sure that students are prompted to do the things that they want to do. Okay, so the punchline then was overall, are we educating educators about academic integrity? And really the answer was no. Now if you're thinking to yourself, well hold on a minute, mate, I run workshops on academic integrity and I teach my faculty what's good, and then they get very good feedback on that and they're very engaged with it and it's really useful and it works. That's all good, and we need to carry on doing that. But I think this issue needs to be part of the mainstream discourse about higher education, about what it means to teach and to learn in higher education. If we think about the studies that show, on average, most students have engaged in some sort of mixed conduct at least once. This is something that is part of the everyday vernacular business of higher education. And we can't separate it out from facilitating PBL groups and marking essays and so on. It has to be part of what we discuss and part of what we help educators to understand. Okay, the next two things I'm going to talk about much more briefly, in part because we've covered them before and because they're coming up later. We reviewed, myself and Chris Lang, a lot of the literature and also our own personal experiences from running workshops on this issue. We reviewed a lot of the things that were being said about how to design assessments that will make contract cheating less likely. And I just want to summarize some of the things that we found, and it's a list that we've touched upon in previous presentations, and we've updated it somewhat. And the main theme that comes out of this is really an emphasis on face-to-face assessment modalities. All right? Assessment modalities that focus on what students can do in front of an assessor rather than writing about what they can do. Again, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Writing an essay and academic writing is a good skill. We want students to learn how to do it. We need to assess that they can do it, but it shouldn't be the only thing that we do. Right? And some simple examples that come up frequently: oral presentations, Viva examinations, narrated video presentations, anything where students are doing something. And obviously in things like in medicine, in nursing, and so on, practical exams are a big part of what we do, but designing practical assessments in other disciplines is probably not as challenging as we might think it is, and I think there's a lot that we can do here to promote these types of face-to-face assessments. And a key point, I think, is that if we do this, if you read those textbooks that I just talked about, and they tell you what makes a good assessment, regardless of academic integrity or misconduct, these things come up. The point being that if we make our assessments good, we probably make academic misconduct less likely, and the students have a better experience, our assessments are better, and so on, and everybody wins. I'll whistle through a couple of the other things. Portfolio assessment, something very trendy in higher education at the moment. We assess in multiple different areas at multiple different times. Bring those all together to make more holistic judgments about learning. Make assessments personal and specific. In-class coursework is a very commonly suggested approach to this. And a couple of things that are a bit more problematic. Anonymous marking is something that's very important, certainly in UK higher education. I know it's not as prevalent elsewhere. There's a very good reason why we mark anonymously, and we have to factor that in. The person who's doing the face-to-face assessment doesn't necessarily have to be the person who's taught the students. And again, more traditional exams, but I think we've discussed that. All right. Briefly then, some of the work we've been doing on the legal side. And what I'm going to do here is slightly different to what's coming up in a workshop later on. I'm going to plug our own workshop that's coming up very soon. Michael and I are hosting a workshop on legal approaches to tackling essay mills and contract cheating. And I want to be clear, we did submit this together. My name is on it. I'm not giving myself ghost authorship for the workshop, even though it's only Michael's name in the program. What we're going to do there is we're going to focus on what might a legal approach look like. All right? Now there's a question that comes before that: should we pursue a legal approach? All right? And we won't really consider that in the workshop. We're going to get to what might it look like if we do. Here I'll talk a little bit more about whether or not we should pursue a legal approach. Again, this is something that we've worked on. Chris Lang and I reviewed this in this chapter, and I must say Chris has to take the vast majority of the credit for this part of the work. Basically, the business of these companies is currently largely legal. Right? There are ways that you can interpret it, but on the whole, these companies are doing nothing wrong. There are some countries that have specific laws against some of these behaviours, but there are not rafts of prosecutions in those countries. It doesn't really work. Okay, so very briefly, the final thing I want to talk about: is this something we should be doing? And this is something that I did talk about in 2015, and I'm very conscious that in 2015 I was very much against the idea of pursuing a legal approach to dealing with this. And 2 years of energetic conversation with colleagues and friends and people working on this have turned my head somewhat, and I can see some merit to pursuing this problem from a legal approach. But there are lots of complicating factors associated with it. And the research that I want to show you, I think, highlights some of the things we have to be very careful about if we're going to try and do this. So the summary then, and again this is a slide that we showed in 2015, but it's been updated since then, arguments for and against, in summary, taking a legal approach to dealing with this issue as a whole. One of the biggest problems is just determining whose law this is. All right? That graphic I showed you at the beginning has a student, their university, a company, the company's writers, the company's website, and there are also advertisers to think about. All of those could be in a different country. So it's difficult to know how you'd even start to pursue them from a legal perspective. It's difficult to know actually what the crime is. Is somebody committing fraud? Is somebody violating trading standards principles or other legal problems? And that makes it very difficult to identify how we might go about this legally. It's difficult to know who the victim is. Is it the other students whose peers are gaining an unfair advantage? Is it the university that's possibly being defrauded? Is it the people who are paying the fees of the person who's going to university? Is it the student who orders a pass, orders a distinction and only gets a pass? It has... or who fails? Yes. A victim, but perhaps not from a legal perspective. It's hard to detect, so we might be chasing shadows anyway. Prevention, I think, is perhaps more helpful. The companies themselves have disclaimers that say this work is only for reference. Don't submit it as if it was your own. And then an argument that comes up frequently about the basic idea of prohibiting anything, and I think Mike Reddy from the University of South Wales brought this up in an online discussion recently. An example that's often used is prohibition of alcohol, which has been tried in many countries and has failed in many countries. Making something illegal doesn't necessarily make it go away. On the counter to that, there's the idea that if something is illegal, it becomes a deterrent. If you're thinking about working for one of these companies or setting up a website to do this and you know it's illegal, you should, in theory, be less likely to do it. What is the crime? I identified as a problem with as a reason for not using a legal approach, but it's actually also a reason for pursuing one. This is a modern problem, or at least the detail of it is very modern, and the law needs to keep up with the modern these modern practices. I think it changes the context. I think is one of the most powerful arguments for this. When we have our conversations with students, at the moment we say to them, okay, this is how you do the right thing. There are some things that you shouldn't do. One of them is these companies. They're very naughty, they're very bad, please don't use them. If the conversation says these are illegal, then I think the context is very different. It's just one part of an overall approach. There are lots of things we can do, and to counter perhaps the argument about prohibition, there is also another very simplistic argument to be made perhaps around guns. Now I really don't want to get into an argument about gun control, but I think even the most partisan opinion on this would recognize that where it's far easier to get hold of guns, there is more gun crime. It doesn't mean there's more crime in general, but I think we can counter the simplistic arguments about prohibition in the law one way or the other. The final thing though, and perhaps the most compelling, is when you show people this, people who aren't familiar with it, or so-called lay people, and what's possible, and they say, but surely this is illegal. Right? And perhaps it just should be illegal. Let me show you finally two pieces of data, again from the study I've been doing with Rebecca. And we asked staff and students, we asked staff actually only in this study, to write their agreement with two questions. And one of them was, a company that sells an essay knowing that a student is going to submit it as their own is committing an act that should be illegal. Right? And we asked them to write their agreement with that, and we talked you through these data. They're arranged around the midpoint of the distribution, so neither agree or disagree, and you can see that the majority of the responses are to agree with this statement. So our respondents are saying, our staff are saying, yes, this should be illegal. However, we also asked them the same question about the behavior of a student. A student who purchases an essay written by someone else, submits it as if it was their own, is committing an act that should be illegal. Do you agree with that? And they did. Right? And here I think we get into very difficult territory. Right? We really have to think this through. If we're going to pursue this legal approach, what some of the unintended consequences might be. Because currently, the legal status of the transactions between a student and the university are very privileged. They're very unusual in the law. And I don't know whether this is somewhere that we really want to go. At the very least, think about what you would be doing if you witnessed an incident, you've discovered that a student had purchased an assignment, you become a witness to a crime. And what does that mean, and what does that mean for our relationship with students and everything. I really think we just have to work this through. People were more encouraged about the idea of making companies illegal, but there was agreement with both. And again, the final point is that we worked through the legal status of some of UK registered companies and compared them against the UK Fraud Act, which we'll talk about much more later on. But really, when working through what it means to have committed fraud, and looking at all the actors in this situation and thinking, which one of those is committing a behaviour that from a legal perspective perhaps looks most like fraud, the uncomfortable truth is that if we're going to do that, it's possibly the students who are committing a fraudulent act. Now, again, I'm not saying we should do that, and I have to be honest, on balance, I think we probably shouldn't. But we do have to think through where we might end up if we start following this path. The conclusion of the question, are SA mills committing fraud, was that they're not. But in the interest of time, because I'm being waved at, I'll skip through that. The final point to make then is just that we can take a step back from a legal approach and really, we can get to the same point in part perhaps by taking a regulatory approach. The people who determine whether or not universities can be universities and whether or not they're doing a good job, in the UK's case the QAA, if we have it as part of their descriptors about what universities have to do, then it will get done. And we can work with them and other regulators to include some of the things we've talked about. I'm really, really excited about this idea of this star rating for academic integrity systems and institutions. In the modern higher education market, universities are clamoring for anything that adds value to them as an institution, being able to say our systems have been signed off by the European network, I think will really help. And similarly, many different degree courses are accredited. This is the accrediting body for some accountancy courses. All different types of courses are accredited. If in the requirements for accreditation, we can make specific requirements to promote academic integrity and make it less likely that these things, other things will happen, I think we might get something. So finally, in summary then, what can we do? Summarize everything that I've talked about. We can try and do more to understand this issue. What does it look like? Where does it come from? Why are there 1,000 of these sites? Why are students using them? We're getting very far with that, but there's still a lot more we can do. We can promote academic integrity, we can teach students about it, we can teach staff about it, and we can make it something that's part of what it means to be an academic in HE. We can design good assessments that will promote good learning and make misconduct harder. And we can continue to work with the people that set the rules and regulations that govern what we do to make sure that they're aware of this issue and doing something about it. That's it. These are the references, of course, very important in any presentation, particularly the one about academic integrity, to the work that we've done. And if I have a moment or two, I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has. Thank you.